Okay, here we go.
Yay.
And hello and welcome, Dev Days Europe. We are on day two, and I would love to welcome you to the Brilliant Teams track, where we've got some amazing talks coming up today of how we can all be brilliant teams. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Kate Edwards, who is CEO of Geography. Hello there.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. Please, the floor is yours. If you share your screen, let's
Okay.
go.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Obviously, it would have been nice for us all to be together in Vilnius, but hey, the fact that we can still get together virtually still works, and it's great that we can do that. So hi everyone. Again, I'm Kate Edwards. Just to give you some context, I am a geographer who has been working in the game industry for about 28 years. So I work with a lot of teams, a lot of franchises you've probably heard of, like Halo and Age of Empires and Mass Effect and Call of Duty and FIFA and a lot of other things that you're probably familiar with if you're in the game space or if you like to play games. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is something that is become more and more of a challenge for teams who are creating content and working in games. Now, this may or may not be directly relevant to your specific job function, but I think it's a topic that it affects everybody who's not only working in games or creative media, but who is working in anything technical that has a globalization component, meaning that your product goes around the world and is used by people around the world. And the challenges that we're facing, it happens to be related to the fact that there are governments and institutions and other forces that are basically trying to regulate more forcefully what kinds of content and technology can be spread around the world. And it's becoming more and more of a crisis for a lot of companies to deal with. And that's what I wanted to talk about because I think it's something really important that we need to be very eyes wide open about as we go about our jobs in the tech sector and in games. Just to give you a little more context of what I've been doing for my whole career is essentially as a geographer in this space, I've been exploring this interaction between what is real, the real world objects out there, what is represented, so how we represent those things in games, on maps, and other things. Like, for example, the background here, you may not recognize, it looks like Los Angeles, but that is actually the fictional city of Los Santos from Grand Theft Auto 5 that is rendered in a very amazing detail. And the other part of that component, though, is also exploring what is perceived. And that's a critical component because it's like we can take objects from the real world and represent them in a game environment or emulate them in a game environment. But then how people perceive that, that is the cultural, social, political, religious dimension of how humans interact with information and content. And that's really critical to how people receive the information and perceive it. So, why is this important? Especially in the game industry, we ask this question, why is it so important to have a focus on what's happening out there in the world? Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that, games are a global business. It is the largest form of entertainment on earth, far surpassing film and music and other forms of entertainment. From the statistics from last year, if you see the amount of gamers regionally, a lot of people that I talk to, especially because I travel a lot, and I visit a lot of emerging markets around the world, and I'll often see developers wanting to get their games or get their content into the United States or into North America or into Western Europe because they say that's where all the money is. That's where we're going to get a lot of attention. Um, but that isn't necessarily true from an empirical standpoint because if you look at the numbers here, the where the growth is truly happening in the game space is in non-traditional markets. It's not in North America and it's not in Western Europe. It's in the Middle East and Africa, which is exploding in terms of game adoption. Also, the Asia Pacific region and Latin America. All of these regions are growing very quickly. And yet, when I talk to a lot of developers, both at small studios as well as the large, what we call AAA studios, like Sony and Microsoft and Epic and other companies like that, not all of them are really focused on the idea that their games are going to be played by people all around the world. And so that's where my job comes in, is part of my work is to help them understand the implications of what they're creating and how it's going to be received in these different markets around the world. Now, to give you a bit of a difference between localization and culturalization, I think most of you probably have heard about localization, which is mainly focused on language translation. And so that is essentially, taking the written content and translating it into the local language to make sure that it's compatible with the linguistic expectations. And that's always going to be important. That's been happening in software for many, many decades, and it's always going to be critical. But more companies today are taking a step further. So they're designing the content and designing the experience, whatever the software might be, to go beyond language. So now they're looking at all the other factors that can also influence a positive perception of their product, which means icon design, the color usage, the UI design, all of these different things influence how that might be perceived. And, obviously we want it to be perceived positively. And so this is what culturalization is. Culturalization doesn't necessarily focus on the language component. It focuses on all the other aspects of content and of the experience that is being created to make sure that what you're delivering is going to be perceived positively. So essentially, what I'm doing in my work is taking the game worlds that game developers are creating and seeing how those worlds are compatible with the local worldviews in all these different markets. And so what we're doing is basically what I consider to be sort of this gene splicing exercise of trying to see how can these two visions, the game world and the local worldview, how can we make those compatible so that the content is going to be culturalized. And so I work in this zone in which the content assets, the images, the sounds, everything, the environment, character design, all these different content assets, they're either going to be compatible or incompatible with the expectations of that local market. And that's my job, is to try and help companies navigate that compatibility issue. Now, there's multiple considerations that we have to make for these decisions. It's not just a simple matter of looking at something and saying yes or no. What we have to think about are some of the many layers behind the decision. So, for example, the high level company values and goals. So, and this also can apply, you can replace the word company with individual or creator. Um, your values as somebody who's working in this field matter in terms of what kind of decisions you're going to make. And for a lot of companies, they have their values stated on a public website. Values about diversity and inclusion, values about freedom of speech, and all these other things. And oftentimes, what they create doesn't always reflect the values that they publicly state, and so there's a disconnect there that might need to be addressed. We also have to think about the context in which content is created. And what I mean by that is that, of course, we all come from different backgrounds, different geographies, cultures, languages, and so forth. And we all have a different approach to how we create things. And that basically means we all have a certain level of bias that we carry with us. And that bias is not, I'm not necessarily saying it's a negative bias. It just means the reality that we cannot know everything that we should know, and so that's why we educate ourselves, and we become less biased because we go through education. And so it's important to make sure that as we make these creative decisions, that we're not introducing bias into the process. And so we need an additional way of checking whether or not the bias is there. Also, the business strategy for the vertical is important, because if you look at larger game companies like Microsoft and Sony, they make a lot of other products besides games. So when they make a decision around culturalization, they have to decide how that decision will impact not only the games they're making, but also all the other business verticals that they represent. And also looking at the market strategy for the specific market, because all the markets are different. You don't approach each market in exactly the same way because they're not the same. And the market strategy for a specific game, like World of Warcraft, for example, how do you position a game like this in China versus the United States versus Germany versus Lithuania versus anywhere else? Because not all game types are played by everybody around the world. Not everyone in these different cultures likes the same kind of games. And then finally, we also have to be thinking about the changing geopolitical, cultural, and social factors that are happening in our world. I mean, we are all very much aware aware of what's happening in Ukraine right now, and I can tell you from direct experience that I have had to work with a lot of my clients over the last couple of months to make a lot of changes in different games related to the conflict in Ukraine right now. And they're making changes around Russian related content and other content too, because now we have to be more sensitive to what's happening there. And we want to make sure that we're not presenting something in a game that might be a negative experience that might evoke what's happening in Ukraine. So it's now there's a whole level, a new level of awareness that we have to think about in much the same way that like when 9/11 happened in the United States, it created a huge wave of awareness around issues of Islam and the representation of Islam in all kinds of media. But what we're seeing in the last few years, which has been really concerning to me, is that a larger trend that's been happening over the restriction of content. And so, as companies are trying their best to deliver content that meets local expectations, oftentimes there have been more and more pushback. Now, a lot of this pushback is coming in China. And why is that happening? Well, we're going to talk about that. And I am going to pick on China quite a bit in this talk because they are a good example of this dynamic, but they are certainly not alone. They are not the only country that is doing this, but they are certainly one of the best examples of this. So, for example, this Batman poster was perceived in China as being a support for the Hong Kong protests that were happening a couple of years ago, and so there was action taken against this. Um, and also things like, the representation of China on this T-shirt. This is from the Gap stores, which is, a well-known chain of clothing stores around the world. And there were protests in response to this because what they did not show on the T-shirt was China's claim over the South China Sea and Taiwan. And so you see these women showed up at the Gap stores to protest by wearing a T-shirt that shows the correct map, which is correct from the Chinese perspective. And then there was, stories that came out around this related to this. And the map is not necessarily incorrect. It's just a different worldview. It's a different perspective because the map that the Gap put on their T-shirt is the map of territory that China actually controls and not the territory they want to control. We've also things like seen a lot of map related issues show up on different products over the years. Like, Pakistan changed their map recently to reflect the dispute in the Kashmir region and in northern India and Pakistan. Ethiopia, basically made Somalia part of itself in a map that they published, when the Russia was really adamant that the Crimea, should be shown as part of Russian territory. So Apple Maps made those changes, which has been very common. A lot of mapping services do that. They basically change they change the map based on the internet domain, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Um, then we've seen a lot of things happen in creative media as well. So, like, Disney has gotten into different challenges with their representation of Chinese characters like Mulan, or Doctor Strange. And this is a well-known theme that's been coming more and more prevalent and more obvious. Like even the right when they did the Doctor Strange movie, the first Doctor Strange movie, they made it clear that the Ancient One's character, who in the comic books is Chinese, was changed explicitly to make sure that they were not going to upset China because Disney wanted the film to show in China because China is the world's largest film market, just like it is now the world's largest gaming market as well. So a lot of companies will do whatever it takes to sell into that huge market, but it comes at a cost. It comes where they have to change even the fundamental original content in order to make sure that it's compatible with that local market. And that raises a lot of questions whether or not that the right thing to do. Do you change your content fundamentally in order to appease a particular viewpoint or not? And that's where your values come in. You have to decide, is this something I want to do? And even more recently, this movie Abominable, which was an animated film from DreamWorks, this film was banned in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And the reason for that is because you can see on the wall in this child's bedroom, there's a map of China, and it shows the what they call as the 10 dash line that surrounds Taiwan and the South China Sea. So this is China's claim on these territories, and so the map on the wall was showing those claims. Well, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam are all parties to that dispute. And so they dispute this claim by China. And so when this map was shown on the wall, they were really upset and said, they went back to DreamWorks and said, look, we don't want to see this map in this film. And it's a very quick sequence. It's like 1 second where you see the map, and that's it. So they asked DreamWorks to please remove that little piece of film. So we don't want to see the map. And the strange part, normally in previous times, DreamWorks would have automatically complied because yes, they want the film to sell into Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But in this case, they did not make the change. They pushed back and said, no, we're not going to do that. And I think the reason why is because of this film was co-produced with a Chinese animation studio. It was not made only by the American company DreamWorks. And so the Chinese studio put pressure to say, we are not making this change. And frankly, I think they were not allowed to make that change. Um, and so, unfortunately, that's why the film did not show in those three countries, is because of this 1 second of film that shows the Chinese geopolitical viewpoint. And you can see here that it is a very complicated dispute. The area around the South China Sea, and we hear about that in the news quite a bit these days. There's been a lot of other things that have happened, like China deleted a this football player from their games over because he was tweeting in support of the Muslims and the Uyghur Muslims in Western China who are being mistreated, and we've seen the conflict between Hong Kong and China play out in GTA 5 online. And there's been a lot of other issues coming up in which basically the geopolitical and cultural battleground has been happening in games, and kind of that cultural war, so to speak. And so it has gotten a lot of attention, and games tend to be, because games are currently the most prevalent form of creative media. This is where the battle is happening quite a bit right now, and this is affecting a lot of teams in terms of their ability to decide, like, how are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do? What should be the best approach to take for how we navigate this complex landscape? Because obviously, as a business, you want to take advantage of huge markets like China, but at the same time, again, like I mentioned before, it can come at a significant cost to your reputation as a company in terms of what you're willing to do to make a sale. Um, and a lot of people on social media and a lot of people in the mainstream media are watching these issues very closely. So it's not something companies can do in a subtle way anymore because a lot of eyes are on this problem. Um, so let's take a step back for a minute and talk about, like, how did we get here? Why is this happening now in particular? So traditionally, when anything is created, we have these different content versions, and what I call the default version is basically your pure creative vision. So, for example, if an artist paints a picture and puts it on a wall or sells it to a museum, that picture is the default version. It has not been localized, it has not been culturalized, it's just somebody's pure self-expression. And so, in a lot of creative media like film and books and art, that happens a lot. Television as well, to a certain degree, and games to a certain degree too. But so we have that default creative vision. And then what happened, like, as these industries started growing, and we started expanding globally, we had the single default version, but then it was often localized into a few languages to make sure it was compatible with some of the main regions that were going to be using the software. So, for example, back in the 90s, like when I was at Microsoft back in those days, everybody knows the phrase figs and J. And what that means is French, Italian, German, Spanish, and Japanese. So that was often seen as kind of the most basic localization that you would do. So you have your default version, and then you do figs and J localization, and you're done. You don't have to do anything else. But most products today, most games, most software today is what I would call a globalized version. So it's still that single default that's created in the local market, whether it's Lithuania or United States or wherever it might be. It's created by those people or by the team across the world. And then they do extensive localization. So, for example, a lot of games today are localized into many languages, not just Figs and J. Now you might have 20 or 30 languages today, which are localized, including a lot of Eastern European languages. And then they might do a little bit of culturalization too, which means they're looking at things in the game itself that might be a problem in certain regions. Like, for example, if they find a certain character design might be a problem for the Middle East, they'll do some little minor fixes for it, because then that makes the game accessible to the Middle East, where again they can create more revenue. Um, Finally, though, some companies today are taking even the extra step of creating what I would call a culturalized version. And so they still start with that single creative vision, the single default, but they do a lot of localization and they do a lot of culturalization. And what I mean by that is they really work hard to adapt the content to be very specific to a local market or to a region. And when they do this, they're almost creating a new kind of default version that is specific to that market, because it has been modified so extensively so that it is really only applicable, for example, let's say to the Thailand market, or to India. And some companies are starting to do this, especially in the mobile space, because they have a lot of agility in mobile apps and in mobile games to do this a lot more easily than like some of the larger like PC or console games, which tend to take more years to develop. Um, Here's a few examples to give you some more context. I mean, I worked on this product in Card Encyclopedia way, way back when, a long time ago at Microsoft. And you can see here, this was an old CD-ROM encyclopedia, and this was the map of Turkey that was in the product. You can see there's that label, Kurdistan, that was put on the map by me. And what Kurdistan is, that is a very politically volatile term in Turkey. It's a very controversial term, and so this label on the map is the reason why not only was the product banned in Turkey, but the general manager of Microsoft Turkey was put into jail because of this. And the Turkish government told Microsoft that basically, you take this off the map or he's not coming out of jail. And so we did take it off the map, but we did not remove the entry for Kurdistan from the encyclopedia, because it is a valid region and it's a valid topic. But we just took the label off the map because obviously we wanted our general manager not to spend time in jail. But this is an example of the government using their tactics to basically help or make a company do what it wants. We also had an issue in the time zones, and I realize these are old examples, but this is part of the reason I'm showing you some. This has long time been an issue. Some of these historical examples from almost 30 years ago. But time zones in Windows, the Windows time zone map used to highlight when you would select your time zone. But in India, because the time zone in India is half an hour off of most all the other time zones, you would see this highlight of India's country outline. And this is the reason why the Indian government banned Windows 95 initially, because we were missing the few pixels that represent the India's claim on the Kashmir region. And so the red pixels there, that's the part of Pakistan, that's the part of Kashmir that is occupied by Pakistan, but India claims it, and they want that claim to show even in an outline on a time zone map. And so, because of this issue, this is why the time zone map in Windows just went away, and there is no highlight anymore. Things like this as well, like this is from a video game, Ninja Gaiden, and you can see that there's the line that says country select has the Taiwan flag and it says ROC, which means Republic of China. Republic of China is the term that is used by Taiwan for basically its independent self, if it ever becomes truly independent. Um, and this term ROC will get you instantly banned in China. The Taiwan flag will also get you instantly banned in China. So this line is a very strong political statement. You're saying that the Republic of China is a country, and you're also showing its flag. And so this will get you, this is a huge problem in China. But there's a way around this, because you can see, if you watch the screen, you take the flag away because it's redundant information. You don't need it there. You also use the term Taiwan because it's acceptable to both China and Taiwan. And then you say country/region. because now you're putting the perception on the user. They get to decide, is Taiwan a country or is it a region? Well, it depends where they're from, and it depends what their particular views are. But then you, as a software developer, you're not making that choice for them, and that kind of creates more safety for you because you're not, asserting a particular opinion. And also in Windows, or not Windows, in iOS, you can see how in the versions for that are outside of Hong Kong and Macau, they show the Taiwan flag as an option, but in Hong Kong and Macau, they take the Taiwan flag out because, of course, Hong Kong and Macau are now controlled by China. Um, what we're really looking at with all these issues is what I call a digital battle for mind share. So it's when governments and cultural institutions and factions and all these groups are fiercely competing in the digital space for control or their share of the public mind share. And that's what I mean by that, is that they're all looking for ways to control their perception of what users think the world is shaping the worldview. And that's really what this is all about. And so, what it comes down to is who gets to define the global and local cultural narrative, and what forces are at work to make that, to make those changes, and what is your role and our role as people in the tech and game space in this whole dynamic. I think all of you are very much aware of these programs that have been instituted by countries like the Golden Shield in China, which is also referred to as the Great Firewall of China, or the Sovereign Internet Program in Russia, or North Korea's internet protections, or Saudi Arabia's internet protections. All of these programs are designed to control mindshare. That's the whole reason they were created, is to control the information that people receive, which is why we're seeing this dynamic right now with the conflict in Ukraine. Is the perception by a lot of people in Russia about what's happening in Ukraine is completely different and completely inaccurate compared to what the rest of the world is seeing. And that's because of things like the sovereign internet law in Russia. And that, so it's controlling mind share, and our role in that as software developers is very key to this whole thing. And what I've seen happening is those different versions that I mentioned before. What I see now is a war on versioning. So in the past, we had default versions were pretty much accepted as a reality, and so you could you could make a default version for, like, say, Germany, and then you could send a version to China that has Chinese localization, and you do a little culturalization for China, and China usually would accept that and say, that's fine. We have a version for us, and you have your original version from Germany. But over the last 10 years or so, some countries have become more assertive about what they consider to be the acceptable version. And not just within the content within their boundary. So what we're seeing today is this very aggressive assault on what is allowed to be the default version. And to put it succinctly, what I'm seeing is, like in the example of China, is that rather than having the default version from your country, be the default, China wants their version to be the default for everywhere. And if you don't agree with that, then what they do is they use economic sanctions and political pressure to make you change your viewpoint to fit theirs. Um, and why is this important? Well, there's many reasons why it's important, but one of the things too, and why the digital mindshare aspect is important, is because you can see here adults. This data is a little bit older, and it's even pre-pandemic, so it's increased since then. But you can see the average adult in the US, and this is representative, there's a lot of countries which are similar. The average adult spends over 12 hours a day in front of a screen, on their phone, on game screens, on television. They're looking at something constant. They're looking at digital content constantly during their waking hours. And so that is a huge opportunity for influence over what they perceive. So the key issue here is that who defines the default version of your game's creative vision? And so, one of the things I was alluding to earlier is that there's ways that we've adapted to this environment. And so, when I was consulting for Google, I helped them perfect what we call domain tailoring. And so, what we did is that rather than try and force a specific viewpoint into a certain market, we made it more flexible so that in different markets you will see different versions, depending on where you are. So for here's an example showing Google Maps, and it's showing the northern part of northern India, which is Kashmir. And on the left is what most of the world sees. They see it as a disputed area with all these dotted lines. But in India, you have to show Kashmir as Indian territory, and that is required by law. So even if you had a simple locator map in your software, it's just like a little pop-up map or something in a game or whatever. If it's just, it doesn't matter how simple or complex the map is, if it's not showing Kashmir correctly, the Indian government will ban the content instantly because it does not reflect what I call their geopolitical imagination of what they own out there in the world. And so China does this. A lot of other countries do this. I already gave you a bunch of examples about China. In Argentina, they still call the Falkland Islands the Islas Malvinas because they still claim those islands from the UK. In Morocco, you need to show Western Sahara as part of Morocco, and there's many, many, many other examples. This is just map related examples. You can see here, like in the Chinese domain, this is the whole area of southern China and Tibet along the Indian border. So in the Chinese domain, you see this, and in the Indian domain, if you watch closely, you see this. And so there are significant differences in the two representations, and they are completely not compatible. You cannot serve up both of these versions easily. So you have to have a way to either engineer the ability to be flexible with the worldviews you're offering, or need to make a decision about which viewpoint are you going to represent at the exclusion of the other. Um, and the problem we're seeing, though, with this dynamic of China being assertive about these kinds of things is like they were going to do a exhibit in at the Louvre in Paris about a Genghis Khan exhibit. Well, Genghis Khan is a controversial figure in China because he represents a different ethnic class, like the Uyghur people, and so China was putting pressure on the Louvre in France to not do this exhibition. And eventually the Louvre caved in and did not do it because they feared the ramifications from the lack of Chinese tourism and other issues that might pop up. And then, China put pressure on the three largest US airlines, were all showing Taiwan as a separate destination that you could select. But China pushed back and said Taiwan needs to be shown as one destination within China and not as its own separate destination. And so originally the airlines pushed back and said, well, we're not going to do that. But then China came back and said, if you don't do that, we're going to basically remove your ability to fly to China, which instantly made the airlines comply and do exactly what China wanted. And the same thing happened with the Marriott hotel chain did the same thing. They had Taiwan and Tibet being shown as separate from China, and again, China put pressure on the hotel system to make that change, and then they made the change because the threat was that if they don't make the change, then China would basically start putting sanctions on the Marriott hotels within their territory. In things like this too, where we're seeing this movie Maverick, which I believe is coming out next month, the sequel to Top Gun. In the original film, you could see the jacket that he was wearing film has the flag of Japan and Taiwan on it because it was his father's jacket. It was a jacket, that it was given to him by his father. But in the sequel that's coming out next month, you can see they took the Taiwan flag away and they changed the Japanese flag completely. But it's supposed to be the same jacket, but obviously it's not. And the reason they did this is simply because they want the film to be shown in China. And if the Taiwan flag or the Japanese flag is on that jacket, it's going to face a lot of problems and not be allowed to release in China. In Age of Empires, we had to change history for the South Korean government because we had a scenario where the Japanese here in blue invaded the Korean peninsula in red and basically took it over. And the Korean government said that that never happened. And so we had to actually make a special patch only for Korean players that showed the opposite, where it showed Korea invading Japan instead, which, that, as you can imagine, created a debate on the team about, is this ethical? Is this the right thing to do? And again, it went back to all of those decisions that we made before, like all the questions you have to ask yourself about your values and your strategy for the market, your strategy for the particular game. Um, And Hearts of Iron is another good example where China banned these games because Tibet and Taiwan were not being shown as part of China, even though this whole game is basically like the board game Risk, where you take over the world in different pieces. And the interesting thing about Hearts of Iron, both of these games take place in World War II, which is before technically the People's Republic of China even existed. It came into existence 4 years after the war in 1949. And so the Chinese government is actually reinforcing their perception of their sovereignty even before they even existed. Um, and there's all kinds of issues. There was issues around the Hearthstone tournament in Taiwan, where the winner was posting a bunch of pro Hong Kong statements, and then his voice was shut down by Blizzard. And you have to wonder, why would they do that? It's an American company. It's like, well, it is, but it's also owned. They have by Tencent. Tencent owns a percentage of Activision Blizzard, and Tencent is a Chinese company, and so that ownership gives them a certain level of influence over the things that these companies that are not even based in China. It gives them influence over what these companies might do. And there's many other examples that I'm going to go through here in terms of like the representation of LGBTQ issues have been controversial in different markets. And just recently, China announced that they were going to restrict the representation of LGBTQ characters in video games, which made a lot of Western companies basically say, okay, well, that basically ends our interest in selling in China because they're not going to change their opinions. Um, so the things we have to think about as I'm closing up here is when we release our content into the digital cloud, our content is going to be instantly exposed to a broad multicultural audience. And so there's no taking it back because we know that there's a massive community out there on social media where they are very activist focused, and they will, if you do something that they love and something that they like, you will get this outpouring of love and support. But if you do something that they don't like, you will hear it. As we all know very well, you will hear that backlash and you will have to live with that backlash. And that might be coming from a specific market, or it could be coming globally, depending on what you did. And so that exposure to social media has caused a lot of companies to be extremely fearful of making the wrong decision around these kinds of issues. And so a lot of companies today are desperate to seek help on how do they navigate this space. And a lot of teams are looking for this kind of support too, because they're like, we want to go forward with our project, but we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Um, we have to remember that versioning is very effective. It's been many examples in the past have shown that if you have a default version and that you make a different version for different markets, that works really well. Even making a default version that is for specifically the Chinese market, even though the Chinese government tends not to like that today. But the challenge then becomes like creating multiple versions generates a lot of content and a lot of issues with content tracking. So we have to be really good about version control across all of these different uh, problem or all the different content that we're creating. So the degree of versioning really becomes the choice of the creator, of the company, of you as a creator. How much basically how much do you want to change your content to make it globally viable? And so if I have this little diagram here to kind of summarize what I was talking about, we have a default version, you have globalized versions, you have culturalized versions, and the more you culturalize, the more you're actually creating a new default version, which I was mentioning before. And on this, between these two, staying true to the default version basically means maximizing expression, meaning you're not changing your self-expression or your creative vision. You're basically sticking true to that creative vision. But on the other side, the more we do culturalization, the more we're maximizing exposure, because the more culturalization you do, the more ability you have to send your content and your product to more places around the world, which basically also opens up the opportunity for greater revenue by exposing your content to more markets. And so we also have this dynamic of increasing or decreasing increasing exclusion if we have a default version, because we're not making changes that are going to be inclusive of people from different cultures. So there's a lot to think about here. It's not an easy decision. We don't just quickly make a snap decision. There's a lot of things you have to think about again, the values and goals you have as a creator, and also for that particular product that you're creating. And lastly, I wanted just to mention the point about freedom of creativity, because this comes up a lot with these conversations. Is that you have to exercise your creative vision and make the game or make the product you want to make, but we have to realize that your vision will not always align with the cultural expectations in every country or region. So we have to be really conscious of and intentional about everything we're creating to make sure that this is exactly what we're this is exactly sticking to the goals of this product, and not just kind of making all kinds of extra stuff that doesn't really matter within the product. So we really have to stay focused during the creative process, and we have to really embrace this moral dilemma. So understand the potential versioning conflicts that I mentioned, and and understand what your moral position is on your creative work. Like, under what conditions would you be willing to change your default version for a specific market, and why would you do that? What are you prepared to do for your product success, and at what cost? And you have to think about these things in a very conscious way before you do them. And it's interesting that we're starting to see a little bit of pushback, because, like, when this film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out by Quentin Tarantino, China requested that he remove a certain scene from the film that involved the character Bruce Lee. And this is what Quentin Tarantino said in response. He said, "Filmmakers cannot reduce their work to the lowest common denominator of only content that is deemed acceptable by one of the world's most censorious regimes." So basically, this was his way of saying, no, my default version is what I want to release. If you don't like it, then don't release it in your country. Now, of course, Quentin Tarantino is a famous filmmaker who has the reputation and the clout in order to do that, make that kind of decision. Not everyone has that kind of freedom, but we are hearing more examples where content creators are basically pushing back against this cultural influence and trying to say, you know what, we're not going to compromise our values in order to sell into a certain country. And so there you go. I know that's a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I think I've only left a very short amount of time for questions. So I'm going to go back, and it doesn't look like we have any questions though, but which is perfectly fine as well.
And yeah, thank you for that. That was an amazing 40 minutes to spend listening to. It was the sheer eye-openerness of all of that information. I was watching and thinking the amount of memes that I've seen on Facebook and on Twitter where they show, in animation, and you've got the news desk showing different images depending on which region it's in, and it's like, well, that's kind of interesting. But I
Yeah.
never thought beyond that into the whole complexities behind making the decisions, even without looking into the work that you then have to put in
Yeah.
behind that.
It's a lot of it's very, very involved. I mean, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. I'm working on several games right now, which are very complicated because they're doing representation of different indigenous groups or different faith systems that are outside the norm in terms of most people's experience. And which is all great, because they're basically, being inclusive of ideas that have not typically shown up in games, but it requires a lot more research and a lot more due diligence to make sure we're doing it right. And of course, the best way to do that is you have to talk directly with the people from those cultures and get consultants from that culture to help you navigate that space. And it's challenging, and it takes a lot more time than people expect.
Yeah, I love the fact that you said get the consultants from those different peoples and those different groups, and not just simply ask questions of, because that's quite a different mindset to take somebody into a project and actually make
Yes.
them a part of it rather than just using their knowledge without doing that.
Exactly, and that precedent has been set for a few years now, where many companies are leveraging expertise. Like, I worked on a game called Never Alone, which was about the Inuit people in northern Canada, and that game was basically developed in direct partnership with the tribal leadership of the groups in Canada. And so everything that you see in that game was approved by them, and they gave their input. They made sure it was accurate, and so the development team, the technical side, they were mainly there to just facilitate the technical development of the game, whereas the creative direction was really being, served by the tribal group, which is really, for that kind of game, that's exactly how it should be.
Yeah, I think that's just really it's the way it's got to go. I've seen some lesser examples, and it's just really nice to hear that it is done in the right way as well. I think that the other one that really shocked me, the question that I had down, I think you've pretty much answered it through your talk, was for the culturalization. Is that for the authorities or is that for the community? And
It's a
what do you do
great
when
question.
those two things clash?
That is a great question, and that is often one of the key things you have to ask yourself is, who are we really doing this for? And, usually we're doing it for the consumer. We want them to have the best possible experience. And as being from people from their different cultures, we want them to feel that this was made for them and that they are part of the experience and we intend for them to enjoy the experience. However, that being said, we also know, like many of the examples I gave, there are certain governments that are very restrictive about content, and they are the ones who control distribution, which is ultimately who you have to appeal to. So, in some of these countries, like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia, they control what goes into their country or not. Now, of course, there's always black markets and gray markets and things like that, but for the most part, they make that decision, and so you have to appeal to their sensitivities, which are often far more conservative than most consumers. And so that's why you end up sending content that is more restrictive. And it's interesting too because it is so different from place to place. Because I often get asked by people outside the U.S. like, what does the U.S. government ban certain content? I'm like, no, that's because we have freedom of speech as the First Amendment of our Constitution. But that being said, who controls content in the United States? It's not the government, it's the retail outlets. So it's retailers like Walmart and Target and big box stores, also online retailers. They are the ones who regulate what they will or will not sell, which is the whole reason why, like, even though games in the United States have an NC-17, they have like an adult only rating, which is similar to the NC-17 film rating. Nobody makes adult only games
Yeah.
because none of these stores are willing to sell adult only games, and that's why they don't get made, even though there's a huge demand
Yes.
for games that are adult only.
I can see that. It's, unfortunately, we're out of time. It's I really want to thank you. I do want to say that last thing. It's really important to me that I say this. I was buoyed by the fact that you said there are at least makers out there that take a look at the censorship for the LGBTQ plus community. I'm a member of that community,
Yes,
and it's representation is so important. And it's kind of heartwarming to see that some creators do actually take those morals to heart when they release their content. So it's a,
absolutely.
a little bit of a little bit of sunshine in that part there.
Yeah, there is. It is happening. That trend is happening, and it encourages me as well because I'm finally seeing people willing to stand up and not take, frankly, some of the abuse from some of these
Yeah,
governments anymore, and they're willing to say, our vision matters more than theirs.
yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Like I say, we have to go. We're slightly over time, unfortunately.
Sure.
I apologize to that, people. We will be back in just over 10 minutes with our next session. So you've got time to grab a drink and get prepared for that. And I will see you then. Bye bye for now. Thank you so much again, Kate.
Thank you.
And we're off.